Chapter 34, The Mossad. So it was possible to be abducted by PLO terrorists right in the heart of Jerusalem. That alarming experience served as a solemn warning to Ari. Indeed, he had been very lucky, and he was on the PLO hit list because of what he wrote in his column in the Post. No doubt he'd now been moved up a little higher in targeting priority. That was not a comforting thought. How he wished for his old faithful Luger, left behind in France. Any pistol would do, but there was no way the Israeli government would license him to carry a concealed weapon. What he really needed was a bodyguard. Certainly the Mossad agents who rescued him must know that. However, the Mossad hadn't offered him any protection. He could hardly ask for it, because the surveillance of the PLO group that had abducted him was a top-secret operation, under total wraps. It couldn't be mentioned to the police or even to other Mossad units. He wanted to discuss the need for protection with Yakov and David, but without their knowing about his abduction, they'd think he was paranoid for sure, an accusation he had so recently made against others. Ari decided to avoid the Arab quarter, at least when he was alone, and he determined to put into practice certain defensive strategies for his own personal safety. During the years he'd headed the underground student movement, Ari had read everything in print on the CIA, KGB, Mossad, and other intelligence agencies. He had memorized their tactics, knew all of the most effective surveillance techniques, and knew how to keep from being followed. As often as it had suited his purpose, he'd given Rogers Group fits by dodging the tails they put on him. That experience would now prove invaluable. The first day he began his new modus operandi, he discovered that he was being followed. Moreover, whoever was on his trail was using highly sophisticated methods. It had taken every tactic he knew, and even then he had almost failed to detect them. He ruled out the PLO. Intuitively, he felt it just wasn't their style. Nor was it the Mossad, because they had learned of his abduction only through a bug they had planted in the souvenir shop. Had they been the ones tailing him, he would have been rescued even sooner. It had to be Rogers Group. Who else could it be? And why would they have him under surveillance? It didn't bode well, no matter who was doing it. During the next week, Ari carefully learned all he could about his shadows in an attempt to identify the organization that was following him. They picked him up first thing each morning, were there every afternoon when he left his office to catch the bus home, watched him get off the bus, and made certain that he went to the apartment. Only someone who was a top expert, and Ari considered himself to be that, could have detected the operation. When he went out for his evening stroll, they picked him up again. He was under 24-hour surveillance. Obviously, the house and phones must be bugged as well. So what? He had nothing to hide. But he was determined to find out who was doing all this and why. It took him nearly 2 weeks to learn the details of the operation. Annoying and potentially dangerous, as it all was, he couldn't help admiring the teamwork involved. These guys were the best. It was all directed from a vehicle whose make and color were changed every day. When it was a van, Ari was especially wary. Vans were the vehicle of choice for abductions. There were 3 men on foot. In that way, they didn't have to follow so closely, but could anticipate his route and pick him up at strategic points. All those involved seemed to be Israelis, which puzzled him, since he had eliminated the Mossad as a possibility. Why was such a sizable and expensive operation devoted to him? Ari pondered that question for days without finding an answer. Surely they weren't after information about him. There was nothing to learn. He did the same thing every day, week after week. It had to be Rogers Group. They were probably protecting him to make certain that he stayed alive, unless they had some more sinister motive. After learning the surveillance procedures and making certain that he did so without being detected, Ari decided one evening to turn the tables on his shadows. He suddenly veered from his usual route and headed up a very steep, narrow street that was impassable for vehicular traffic. The command car would have to drive several blocks out of the way and hope to pick him up where the small lane bisected a larger avenue. As soon as he entered the narrow street, Ari turned casually into a variety shop, taking considerable time to browse. Other shops followed at the same leisurely pace. Having set the pattern, he went into a shop on his left near the end of the street. He'd first met the owner a few months ago, and they had become friends. The man had once lived briefly in the south of France, and Ari had offered to coach him in French, dropping in now and then to do so. The shop was long and narrow and full of nooks and crannies that could not be seen from outside. Ari knew that his tails were keeping a safe distance and wouldn't enter a shop unless they became concerned at the length of time he was taking. By then, it would be too late. "I need to ask a favor. Trying to avoid this woman," Ari said apologetically to the owner in French. "Give me a sales pitch on something out near the front of the store. I'll pretend to be interested, but it won't be exactly what I want. You'll lead me to the back of the store to show me something else. Don't ask me the details right now. I'll explain later, but I must get out your back door and over to the next street." "D'accord," said the proprietor with a wink. Then he began talking in a loud voice, motioning to Ari to follow him toward the front of the store. There he went through the requested routine. Ari haggled, and finally the owner loudly declared that he had some other selections of the same item in the rear of the store. Once in the back and out of sight from the street, Ari slipped out the door, while the proprietor kept up a running and enthusiastic dialogue with his now vanished customer. Once outside, Ari went through a gate in the rear courtyard, then ran along the top of a stone wall until he could squeeze down between two buildings and out onto the next street. Hurrying to his right, he reached the next corner quickly and peered around it cautiously. Just as he had thought, there was the command car pointed away from him and in the direction of his presumed route, where they expected him to emerge from the street he'd been on. Sprinting up behind the car on the blind right side that had no mirror, Ari quickly opened the rear door and looked in. His jaw dropped. Totally speechless, Ari stared at the two men sitting in the back seat. "You're a clever devil," exclaimed David in embarrassment. "How did you manage this?" "I don't owe you any explanations," replied Ari angrily. "You owe me some. Why am I being followed?" "Get in," said David, motioning to Ari and sliding over into the middle of the seat. "We'll go somewhere to talk." "Why not your office in the Mossad building?" Ari asked, climbing in beside him. "When did you figure that out?" asked David with genuine admiration in his voice. Ari ignored his question and addressed the man sitting next to David. He had been the commander of his Arab abductors and the one who had so viciously interrogated Ari in the back room of that souvenir shop. "You son of a—" Ari had leaned over to look the man in the eye. "What did you think you were doing? I had a headache for a week." The man nodded toward David. "It was his operation," he said quietly, looking guilty and repentant. Ari fixed David with a cold stare. "I don't enjoy having guns jammed in my back, being tied up and knocked around just for fun. What was that? A training exercise for Mossad recruits?" "We've lost him," crackled the radio. It was a transmission from the team that had been following Ari. "He went into the shop and must have gone out the back door." The driver picked up the mic to reply. "Let me have it," said David quickly, taking it from him. "You say you lost him?" he shouted in agitation. "Then find him. Move." He winked at Ari, but the angry expression on Ari's face didn't soften in the slightest. "Well," said Ari, looking right through David, "let's hear it, and you'd better make it good. Your friend can tell you that the pen is mightier than the sword. He reads my column." David laughed. "You've sure got more than your share of chutzpah. Look, Ari, I apologize, but there wasn't any other way. We needed to recruit you, so obviously we had to be sure you were clean. We also had to make certain that you had the wits and the guts to carry out the assignment, even though our files said you did. I hope you're convinced. How'd you like to have me put you through that torment?" "Look, Ari, we need you, and we didn't have any choice. We had to be sure." "You must have come to your conclusions long ago. Why am I still being followed?" "Actually, we were going to discontinue the surveillance, but we realized you knew all the tricks. So we've used you to train some of our newer men and to improve our techniques." "Thanks a lot. You guys put me through hell. wondering who was after me and why. I should have been on salary for the Mossad. I can tell you every car and van you used, describe every man. Did you know I was watching your team? We suspected you were, but we only caught you at it 2 or 3 times. That's why it was such an invaluable training exercise. By the way, I'm not usually with the team, so you just happened to catch me today. So what's this about recruiting me? You've got some information we need. What are you talking about? We need data on the group that financed your student movement. I thought you were part of that East-West consortium. Why would you think that? Everybody else is. You know it's a joint U.S.-Soviet operation. The U.S. supports Israel. Even the Soviets now have diplomatic ties with Israel. No more Cold War. That's what everyone's supposed to think. But who's really going to risk relations with 200 million Arabs with their oil and 1 billion Muslims for 5 million Israelis? Pretty heavy odds, conceded Ari. So that's why we need your information. Surely the Mossad has done a better job of penetrating their organization than I did. You must have plenty. If you don't know anything that we haven't already discovered, then we don't need it. But there's only one way to find that out. Ari shook his head. Sorry, no deal. You're turning us down? Not for lack of loyalty to Israel. I think you know that by now. Well, then what's the problem? I've placed the full expose with several trustworthy people for release if somebody does me in. That's my life insurance. If I give it to you, then those gangsters wouldn't have any reason for keeping me alive, would they? They wouldn't know that we know. Ari thought about that for a moment, then shook his head again. I know how the Western intelligence community operates. Information is continually exchanged or leaked. I can't take that chance. Okay, said David. I understand. We won't press you. It wouldn't do any good, responded Ari firmly. But you still didn't answer my question. You said something about recruiting. That involves more than just giving you old information. We've got a job for you. It's dangerous, but you're the ideal person to do it. So? Look, I'm stuck with this team. I'm going to really chew them out for losing you. I'll come by the apartment tomorrow evening about 8 o'clock, and we'll go into it in detail. Okay, what about Yakov? No problem. He's worked with us for years. I suspected that. Ari shook David's hand, then leaned over and shook the hand of his companion. No hard feelings, Ari assured him. I just wish your men hadn't been quite so conscientious. Sorry, we had to make it realistic. Ari reached over to open the door to get out. David grabbed him. Get back in here. One of my men might see you. To the driver, he said, Haim, take us to Ari's apartment. Fast. We'll let him out over there and then come right back.